Part 3 of the State Capture Report is now publicly available. Director General in the Presidency, Phindile Belani, received the report from the Secretary of the Commission, Professor Itumeleng Mosala. Just like the previous two parts, the report is lengthy, but ENCA's Thulasizwe Simalane has been taking a look at some of the findings and joins us now via Zoom. And no doubt a tough task that you have been tasked with, Thulas. And let's start with the issue around Mantashe. No significant evidence that he used any influence in any way in the way BUSA had envisioned or the way that they had testified during the commission. What say the reports around this?
So, Rabia, the commission was faced with the question of whether or not the acceptance by Gwede Mantashe at the time when he was serving as Secretary General of the ANC and also in the National Executive Committee of the ANC of security upgrades to his 3 homes provided by BUSA, the 3 homes, one in Elliot, one in Kala, and one in Boksburg, whether that acceptance fit in with the pattern of BUSA of trying to induce and influence public office bearers, elected officials, members of the National Executive Cabinet, as well as functionaries of the state and organs of state to do their bidding. So the difficulty, though, that they had with Gwede Mantashe is that he did not fit nicely into the terms of reference in that he was not a public office bearer to be able to, to be influenced directly by BUSA. But the commission went as far to then say that his description that the ANC was a mere NGO and that as Secretary General he had no influence, no significant influence, could not be accepted because the office of the Secretary General wields significant influence in the ANC and the ANC leads government. But interestingly, the commission concludes that the provision of the security installations was part of the corrupt modus operandi of BUSA executives, including Papale Shabane, who is the man who was central to organizing for these installations at Mantashe's home. But the evidence shows that, Mr. Mantashe himself, there's no evidence that he then acted upon that inducement. So there's no evidence that he acted to further the cause of BUSA. However, he doesn't get off scot-free because the commission then goes on to say to examine whether or not he knew that in making the security installations at his home, BUSA and its executives intended for him to be a link through which they can influence officials in the state, in the national executive, organs of state, etc., etc. And they then frame it in terms of the PRECA, Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, which basically, it's a bit of a complicated wording of it, but they're saying that that should be examined whether Mr. Mantashe knew that BUSA intended for him to exercise influence, even though there's no evidence that he exercised that influence, and what the implications thereof are in terms of any commission of acts of corruption, perhaps by people who are, in organs of state, etc. So no direct link to him in terms of corruption through the receipt of these security installations at his 3 homes, but he doesn't get off scot-free in that the question is being asked based on the assumption that he must have known that Papale Shabane and BUSA intend for him as Secretary General to exert influence and on some officials, whether there can be no permutation through the PRECA for a further investigation then.
Yeah, and we'll get into the issues around the ruling party in just a moment. But I think one thing that has gripped the country for quite some time now, Thulas, is the CR17 campaign and the funding to which it benefited. What is the report telling us in this regard?
Not much is said about the CR17 funding, Ropiwa, but let me just firstly locate it within the section of the report, Part 3, Volume 4, which deals with BUSA as well as these transactions we're talking about. Basically, it starts by examining BUSASA's use of money to try and influence the ANC, and then within that context deals with evidence that was given by President Cyril Ramaphosa. And as you say, we will talk about that in a moment in as far as it relates to the war room, the elections war room that was provided by BUSASA. The line about CR17 donations is really that. It's no more than a short paragraph within the report itself. It basically says that the president testified on CR17, BUSASA donations to CR17, but the commission did not investigate it in any serious way. Those are their exact words. They did not investigate it in any serious way because that matter had been dealt with by the public protector. You'll remember, of course, the public protector in that regard had come to the conclusion, the confusing conclusion that the president had inadvertently and deliberately, contradiction in terms, misled Parliament in as far as the CR17 BUSASA donations are concerned. And that report of the public protector floundered before the courts. So that's where we are. The commission did not investigate this matter in any serious way because the public protector was dealing with it. The public protector's report did not stand the test of scrutiny.
So let's go into the BUSASA issue around the ANC 2014 elections here. What does the report say transpired and really the influence that BUSASA had within the ruling party?
So the commission sought to establish, it took the terms of reference and framed them as questions to be answered based on the evidence. And the question that it was seeking to answer was whether BUSASA sought to induce, certain people in the national executive, that is cabinet, public officials, elected officials, employees of organs of state and state institutions and other legal persons, the ANC being a legal person, whether BUSASA sought to influence all of them to do their bidding in relation to securing contracts through the state. The issue of the war room, basically, it comes in that regard, in that then, the commission concludes that this was part of BUSASA's way of ensuring that the ANC remains in power. And if the ANC cannot directly influence what happens, at the very least, the ANC appoints people. If it remains in power, it will continue to appoint people that BUSASA can then influence in their favor. So it was in BUSASA's interest to then ensure that the ANC remains in power, and the provision of this war room was part of that support to the ANC. The report briefly deals with President Ramaphosa, the question of whether or not he knew that BUSASA was providing this facility for free, basically saying that even though he says he didn't know, he acknowledges that other officials in the ANC, including the Treasurer General, must have known that BUSASA was providing all of these facilities for free. So nothing really turns on that. But, in terms of our democratic hygiene and the political party funding systems that are in place, this was an organization, and as far as this report is concerned, that was providing all of this support to specified individuals and, legal persons such as the ANC for mala fide intentions basically to further their own interests, not in the sense that it was about supporting democracy, but it was about what's in it for us.
No, absolutely. And with that point, Tulas, we've run out of time, but very briefly then we must reflect on Angelo Agrizi's testimony, which turned out to be very controversial, but really proving to be quite insightful in terms of what was happening within the ruling party and the influence that was sought to run the state in a particular way. Obviously, we never got to hear from Gavin Watson, but just a reflection on Agrizi's testimony in this regard.
Well, you mentioned Gavin Watson, the commission, the late Gavin Watson. The commission comes to the conclusion that the evidence of his involvement in corrupt activities is overwhelming, and saying that Mr. Agrizi's evidence can be accepted, except where it is indicated otherwise in specific instances. Basically, the Commission found that Angelo Agrizzi, who had a lot of people, if you remember, who had a lot of people sitting on the edge of their seats, Ropiwa, worried that, you're waiting for your name to be called. Basically from that evidence. There were 257 people who were implicated through the BUSA investigations, and Rule 33 notices were issued to these people to say, look, you have been implicated one way or another. Would you like to challenge? Would you like to cross-examine? 257 people. So a lot of people were sitting waiting for their names to be called when Angelo Agrizzi was testifying. The Commission is balanced in assessing Angelo Agrizzi's performance, but actually the balance favors him more than it is against him. The Commission points out that there are instances where his evidence was inconsistent and contradictory at times. They cite specific examples, which I won't go into because we've run out of time. But then the Commission then comes to the conclusion that notwithstanding these observations, on the main pillars, Mr. Agrizzi's evidence there was substantial corroboration for Mr. Agrizzi's evidence, and even though he tried to lessen his own conduct, even on his own version, Mr. Agrizzi was guilty of criminal conduct on a substantial scale. But having said all of that, because there was corroboration by other investigations, by other witnesses, by the Commission's own investigations, the conclusion is then made that Mr. Agrizzi was in the main a truthful witness.
Absolutely. Tulas, of course, you'll continue to comb through the details of the report, and we'll catch up with you a little bit later on, perhaps first thing in the morning, Tulas. So no sleeping for you this evening. That's ENCA anchor Tulas Izwe-Simelane combing through the third part of the report, which he's just highlighted includes details around BUSA and their influence within the ANC, and then, of course, very briefly, a mention of the CR17 funding.